Hello everyone, Republic Jim here. It's another frosty October morning in Republic, and in fact it's kind of chilly at the moment, but I'm going to go with the window open anyway and keep working on my cold adaptation. So today I wanted to talk about disaster response, as you can see from the title. And the one acronym that everybody needs to know for disaster response and recovery, and right off the bat, just need to make it clear that acronym is not FEMA. They are not the first thing that you should think of when it comes to disaster recovery. They show up later, after the fact, write checks and supposedly coordinate disaster response, but they're never there when they're needed, and their response can be less than satisfactory. So the important excuse me the important acronym that people need to know is one that I learned from Sam, the president of our search and rescue team, and makes a lot of sense. That acronym is YOYO, and what that stands for is you're on your own. Because when area-wide disaster happens that affects a lot of people, there's no way that the federal government is going to be the first one on scene and helping out. And the state is able to step in and do a little bit more, but even with them there's a delayed response. And your local responders are going to be the first ones that can do anything, but in any kind of widespread disaster, they're going to be overwhelmed, and depending on the nature of the disaster, like if it's a hurricane or a wildfire or a blizzard or whatever, they might not even be able to safely get out and do anything until after the worst of the event is over. During the whole thing, they're not going to be able to respond for their own safety. So, even if you have a fair amount of resources locally, it's going to be a delayed response, and because there's so many people in need and likely going to be so much widespread damage, they have to prioritize and just get to everybody as they can. And you're never going to get an immediate response. In normal circumstances, we take it for granted that in an emergency we can just dial 911 and somebody's going to respond at least relatively quickly. In rural areas, we still have to assume that it's going to take a while before anybody shows up. But in a disaster, even if the phones are working, which is questionable, it's not going to do a lot of good to call 911 because their lines are going to be swamped and they just will not have enough resources to respond to everybody immediately. So keep in mind, we all need to be prepared for ourselves and our families and whatever loved ones are immediately around us. We have a responsibility to be prepared to be our own first responders, and to plan accordingly to be able to do that. There's going to be things that come up. Nobody can be prepared for everything. Stuff will happen where we're simply not able to manage it anyway, and we need assistance. But if we're planning on being our own first responders and doing everything we can to take care of ourselves, we'll be far better off and able to respond to most simple emergencies or even a lot of widespread disasters. And then just as part of planning for that, keep in mind the rule of threes. And in case you're unfamiliar with that, the rule of threes is how long you can survive without certain things. Basically, it's just rough approximations, but it's 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter in severe conditions, and we have deer in the road. 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. And a lot of people, when they're planning, and especially like if they have to bug out, evacuate their home in a flood or a fire or something, they tend to immediately think about food. But that should actually be the last priority. It's nice to have food, and if you have the luxury of hauling along food or staying in your house and having adequate food, then that's great, but that's pretty far down the list when it comes to a disaster. As far as the 3 minutes without air, there's not a lot I can say about that. It's kind of hard to prepare for that. That's something that's just going to be an immediate response to try to get air. Although, if you live anywhere near a creek or river, keep an eye on weather forecasts and conditions, and if there's a storm with significant rainfall, be prepared for water coming up quickly. Or, if you have to go across a flooded roadway, be extremely cautious about that, because you could get in a position where air is your immediate concern. Drowning is very real when it comes to floods and such, and that's a big problem. But a lot of that can be mitigated if you pay attention and plan wisely. As far as shelter, that can, for the severe conditions, that can either be in the winter, freezing temperatures, snow, rain, wind, or it can even be in the summer when it's just blazing hot. Either way, you need some sort of shelter. Ideally, that would just be your house, but again, if you have to evacuate, then you need to have some way of getting to shelter within that 3-hour window. It's nice if you have a travel trailer you can use if you have to evacuate, or a tent, or someplace you can go just to set up shelter, make your plans for that. And then once you have that shelter, warmth or cool or whatever, and appropriate clothing, then water is a big one. Everybody should be trying to store water if at all possible. Have some on hand. Have a way to purify water, way to get water if you have to, and maybe a hand pump or something. There's a lot of options, but that should be far more of a priority than food when it comes to disaster, as we've seen in the recent hurricanes where people lost water. That all of a sudden becomes a really big deal. So plan for that. And then finally the food. But as I say, that's not especially a big deal, but keep all those priorities in mind. Plan on being your own first responder. Remember that acronym, YOYO. This has been Republic Jim. I'll talk to you later.